Congressman Michael McCaul, thank you so much for joining us. First off, it's been 20 years since 9/11. What do you remember about that day?
You know, that threat had been building since 1993 and even before that time. But I remember watching it on television with my daughter as a second airplane hit the tower. And I realized it was no accident at that point in time. It was premeditated. And I knew at that time, just given my background, it was Al-Qaeda that was behind that. And it changed everything. It woke up the American people to the threats that are still out there today. But the brave heroes, first responders who responded to that fateful day, the firefighters, police officers, and really the goal of Al-Qaeda that day was to hit the economic symbol of power, the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, the symbol of military power. And the third target they missed because of the plane that went down in Shanksville because of the heroes. And that was headed towards what in Arabic they call the House of Laws, which was the United States Capitol. And thank God we didn't have that image of an airliner hitting the Capitol. And since that time, I've dedicated most of my professional career, both at the Justice Department and in Congress, to keeping Americans safe, from the threat.
And given your background before being in Congress, how has counterterrorism changed in the past 20 years?
Significantly. We formed the Department of Homeland Security. We ramped up a lot of prosecutions. It would be very difficult to pull a 9/11 scale attack, I think, today with that great amount of sophistication. It's usually going to be something inspired by social media. It'd be very difficult for them to get in country and to plan at that level without being detected. That's the good news. Bad news is, Afghanistan is under Taliban rule now. Some of them very hardened terrorists. There's a recruiting of jihadists out there right now because of their victory they claim over the United States. And so I think Afghanistan is reconstituting to pre-9/11, but even more dangerously because they have all these weapons over there. And I think it's going to be a threat we're going to have to deal with moving forward. Some would say the war has ended, but I can tell you the threat has not.
And speaking of those threats, have those changed, or how have those changed over the past 20 years?
I really have to thank our military and our veterans who served, that they did make a difference, that it wasn't for nothing, that they stopped another large-scale 9/11. When I chaired the Homeland Security Committee, I got monthly briefings, terror threat briefings, on external operations to kill Americans or our allies out of the region. And our special forces went in and eliminated that threat. And it worked. The bad news is today, with our complete evacuation, we don't have the eyes and ears on the ground anymore. We don't have that intelligence capability to see the threats so we can stop the threats from occurring. And that's something that I've been really pushing the administration on, we're completely out of there now, but we need to have that intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capability.
Now, you mentioned with these evacuations, the Taliban back in power. I hesitate to ask, but there have been conversations I've had just, around here. Are we back to square one?
I do think we're more sophisticated to stop it, but I think we are going back to a pre-9/11 state. The number 2 guy in the Taliban government now is the head of the Haqqani network, which was basically a pipeline from Pakistan to Afghanistan of extremists. They're not a new and improved Taliban. They are going back to their old ways. Al-Qaeda has always targeted the infidel. And now the difference is they have all these weapons, cache of weapons, RPGs to helicopters to a lot of cash that we gave the Afghan army that they took over. And we don't have Bagram Air Base or a embassy to collect intelligence and be able to have eyes and ears in the region. So that makes it more dangerous, in my judgment. So I think they're going to reconstitute their government, but they will go back to their aspirations of attacking the infidel wherever the infidel is.
In the past 15 years or 16 years, excuse me, that you've been in Congress, past 20 years since 9/11, how has counterterrorism funding changed?
We put a lot of money into it. We also have grants to state and local. You know, I was with a lot of our local Austin police this morning and fire department, and we have fire grants. We have UOSI, we call them, grants that go to help local law enforcement. At the end of the day, you know, our intelligence community and our FBI, they can do a lot, but it's our local law enforcement that's on the ground that can really see things as they are occurring. Like, well, you know, in New York, I can't tell you, working with NYPD, how we stopped so many things from happening. And, you know, I was just with our, you know, former chief of police in Austin, congratulating him on the Austin bombing situation and how they brought that to a conclusion. So I think it has changed. And I think that was money well spent because it saved American lives.
Also, speaking of the Greater Crime Commission that you're at today, the theme was, what have we learned? And I wasn't able to be there myself, unfortunately, so if you could sum it up for me a little bit. What have we learned in the past 20 years about terrorism threats, about our abilities to handle them, et cetera?
Yeah, it's interesting. I talked to General Wald, who led the invasion at Tora Bora with the Northern Alliance. He said we got so close to taking out bin Laden. And think about that, how that would have changed the course of history. We never probably would have been diverted into Iraq. I doubt we would have nation builded and occupied Afghanistan. I think one of the lessons learned that they'll teach at the War College is this idea of trying to nation build and occupy countries. Remember, many empires have died in Afghanistan, going back to Alexander the Great. I think it was well intentioned. I think all along, though, it probably should have been a counterterrorism mission to take the threats out, and we need that intelligence capability as well. But you know what? To those who served, they did stop another large-scale attack, and they liberated the women in Afghanistan, and the women were educated, and they made a difference for 20 years. I worry about the women left behind now, along with the interpreters and Americans there, but the women who are now going to be forced to be under the rule of Sharia law and the Taliban's backwards treatment of women and being really sold off as slaves to the warlords.
It's been 20 years, but really, where do we go from here? How do we continue to move forward?
Well, you know, threats are always evolving. That's one thing I've learned. You always got to stay in front of the threat. You have to see it and stay in front of the evolving threat. I do think you'll see a resurgence of radical Islamist terror, but we also can't take our eyes off the ball of our foreign nation adversaries, particularly Communist China. I think China is probably our #1 competitor globally, both economically and militarily. They are now very much keen on Taiwan after they've seen us be defeated in Afghanistan. It empowers our adversaries like Russia, China, and Iran. And we have to keep a close eye on that. And so, you know, the border is another issue. But radical Islamist terror has been around, and it's going to be around for a while. But we also have a myriad of other threats. And I would say long term, the greatest national security threat is the Communist Chinese Party and their ambitions and their theft of intellectual property and their aggressiveness to become the #1 superpower. Saturday
being 20 years, what does it mean to you?
You know, I dedicated, it's 18 years in Congress. I was a counterterrorism federal prosecutor after 9/11. You know, Admiral Inman and I talked about our experiences through the last 20 years and, you know, the things that we did to stop bad things from happening. And I reflect on that. I think, though, what saddens me is that on 9/11, the 20th year anniversary, we're going to see the Taliban have their inaugural ceremony and a celebration of their defeat of the United States of America, and they will raise the Taliban flag over our United States Embassy. And to me, that makes me very sad.
To the people in your district from from Austin to Houston, what's your message to them tomorrow?
You know, when you see a veteran, say thank you. When you see a law enforcement officer, say thank you. Firefighter, thank you. Our first responders, you know, our military that's protected us, and they always do, and the sacrifices that they gave, and the friends they lost, and they lost their limbs. They have PTSD. And tell me it was worth it when they asked that question, that they did keep this nation safe for 20 years. And they liberated a generation of women and girls in a very, very primitive country. And for that, we are, as a nation, are eternally grateful.
And on the flip side of that, to your colleagues, what's your message to them tomorrow?
Yeah, to my colleagues, this should national security should never be a partisan issue. It should stop at the water's edge. And I hope we can analyze the events of this summer up to today and how did this go so bad? How did we get this so wrong? You know, it didn't have to happen this way. And you don't leave Americans behind enemy lines. You don't leave our interpreters who worked with our special forces and put their lives on the line behind to be executed by the Taliban. And we have to establish that intelligence capability in the region to protect, America and our allies.
And finally, of course, what's your message to the Biden administration about, what's happened the past few weeks and, again, the past 20 years since 9/11?
You have to be ever vigilant. You can't let your eye off the ball. And when we do that, we find that it comes back to bite us. And so they want to say it's all over and we just walk away from the situation. But we are engaged in a global effort of, basically countries that are oppressive, communist regimes to theocracies like Iran, that the world is still a very dangerous place. And it's really freedom and democracy versus very dictatorship countries that oppress their own people and take away their people's own freedoms and violate human rights. And we have to be the beacon of hope for human rights across the globe and stand for that. That is America, as I know it, as we know it. That's our value. Our values prevail at the end of the day over that darkness.
Is there anything else you wanted to add about the significance of tomorrow or the impact that the past 20 years has had on the United States and beyond?
Well, it's been a burden, but NATO shared it with us. I think we need to share the burden of what comes next. But we still have to move forward with a intelligence capability to have eyes and ears in Afghanistan, but also in the region where we have gone dark. This will have major national security consequences if we don't fix it. I haven't seen a whole lot of progress right now by this administration. Secretary Blinken will be testifying before my committee on Monday, and I plan to ask him about what his plan is moving forward. By all accounts, our allies have been critical, and it has emboldened our adversaries, and it has diminished our standing in the world. And that is probably what concerns me the most, in addition to the lives that are being lost as I speak in Afghanistan, but are standing in the world to the work we're going to have to do to build that back.
And actually, one last thing that I just thought of. You always talk about the bipartisanship that you try and work with with any bill or with any law that is, going through Congress. Tomorrow being 20 years and seeing the divisiveness that we've seen in our politics over the past, even just the past few years. Talk to me about the unifying aspect of 9/11 and tomorrow and the significance of tomorrow.
Well, it did unify the country, just like Pearl Harbor did. And we came together not as Republicans or Democrats, but as Americans. And I think that's a very sacred day, 9/11, that we come together as Americans. I always say Al-Qaeda doesn't check our political stripes. They don't care if you're a Republican or Democrat. It's the fact you're an American. And I think it's a rallying cry for us to come together as a nation, as Americans, to honor those who lost their lives that day. For no one knows of the 3,000 whether they were registered Democrat or Republican, and it doesn't matter because they were Americans and they lost their lives on a very tragic, dark day to a very dark force.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Congressmember McCaul. I appreciate taking the time to do this interview today.
Yeah, thanks for having me so much.